I provisionally titled this Technology and Data-Driven Collaboration, Archaeological Practice in the 21st Century. And I think we'll go back to these themes of how changes through the century have impacted on research practice. But to get things out in the open, unless stated, all of this stuff is available either in the public domain or under a Creative Commons by attribution license. Pretty much all of the illustrations I've produced are on my Wikimedia Commons page. Essentially, that's how I publish stuff now. I don't have to ask journals for the use of my own material anymore, which is nice. Anything about citations in the public domain, feel free to do pretty much whatever you want to do with it, subject to licensing. Now, my background is mixed, but it's predominantly been within archaeology. And we place a great deal of reliance on the relationships between data, theory, and practice. And we perform experiments. We go out on excavations. We do landscape surveys. And this provides us with evidence. And we perform more of these experiments, and we start to collect quite a bit more evidence. And as we've got more of this evidence, we can use theory to start to join the dots up between those bits of evidence to start to create a narrative and a story. And we can create multiple different stories around the evidence on a competing basis if you decide to take that approach. And as we gather more and more evidence, we can see that some of those theories just don't fit the data anymore, so we can start to discard them. And all of the theories that we have make assumptions. And in the words of Bill Clinton, working on a basis of keeping it simple, stupid, the ones that make the least assumptions are more likely to be true. So we tend to focus on those theories that have the fewest assumptions that fit the data. And this provides us with as accurate a picture as we can of the past. So we've got all of these different hypotheses wrapping around the data, producing models through which we try to produce narratives that gives us a picture of the reality. But we also know that there isn't a real reality of the past. It's conceptual realities. It's very much dependent upon the contextual viewpoint, the position you take while you're applying your theoretical approaches and your models. Our data comes from a variety of different sources. So excavations, you have soil texture, bulk samples, artifacts, ecofacts, contexts, the way you define blocks of soil into supposedly homogeneous units that tell you stuff. We record it with plans and sections. We record colours in standard and non-standard ways. But we also look at these things at different scales. So we have landscape analyses. We look at luminescence on rocks. We look at resistivity data, magnetometry, geoprovenancing, a whole heap of stuff, all to build these models to give us a little bit more information about the past. And so it's a knowledge acquisition process where we're dealing with dynamic data. Sometimes the nature of this data changes. So, the pottery specialist will clump and split and say that your type 2 is the same as my type 3, and so everything changes, and that should feed down through to the evidence. And so this dynamic feedback allows us to address variations in theory and practice and to test and revise them over time. But it's also not done in isolation. It's broadly conducted by people, and so their experience feeds into what's being recorded. The weather has an important impact. If it's nice and dry, you tend to be a bit happier, but when it's snowing or raining, your recording suffers dramatically. So your mood impacts on this. Policy impacts on it. Peers, and the way that you're actually starting to pull things together, the recording system. There's a whole range of subtle variations in how you can deal with your data. And then once you've got your data together, you have your primary data, your excavation records, your remote sensing transcripts, your lab analyses, and your decoupled synthetic data, because most archaeological works in the UK are conducted under a professional umbrella, where we're part of a planning process. And so you produce site reports or historic environmental reports. But we put these into silos. And we start to build walls around our data. I've had problems with the internet connection here. And this is proving that at least some of it is working. If you pull this down from this link above, you'll see this is a larger one. But sorry, there's a larger picture underneath this. But ultimately, underneath here, you'll see the silos that are being built around data. And in fact, there's people who are populating these and are trying to reach over and climb through and help each other. So you're seeing the differences between the formal way in which we start to deposit data and the informal way within which people actually naturally want to start to share it and liberate it. That's a problem. And at least in the UK, the archaeological repositories ended up becoming, in the words of English Heritage, a little used, if you can see it down here, a little used and inaccessible data mountain. And this was 1995. Obviously things have changed, but they haven't changed necessarily that much. And this impacts on decision making. If you start to put a block around the knowledge which you use to make your decisions, you can't make more informed decisions. So you have, the data that you're aware of, your accessible knowledge, which is essentially your decision-making resource. Then you have your inaccessible knowledge, that knowledge which is maintained in a silo which you do not have access to. Now, you might know it's there, you might know, how to get it, but it's not available in a timely manner. It does not have an impact on what you do. And then there's a whole heap of other stuff that floats around the edges that might have an impact on what you do, but you just don't know about it. So you get into this Rumsfeldian thing of the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. The point of all of this, if we're going to improve the decision-making process, is we make that as big as possible. And so this is the context within which DART was commissioned. And DART was a project, a detection of archaeological residues using remote sensing techniques, funded under the Science and Heritage Programme from EPSRC and AHRC. And we're really looking at the dynamics of seeing beneath the soil. So I'll start out here. It's an issue of prospection. So in the past, someone digs a ditch. They've decided to move away and it's abandoned and it fills up either through natural process or people just throwing stuff into it. That starts to stabilize over time and then it's kind of properly incorporated back into the landscape and you can't really see that it's there. And we use prospection techniques to find what's there. So here you're seeing a wall and a ditch feature and you're seeing variations in crop growth and crop health as stuff is growing over that wall, variations in microtopography as sun highlights come in and variations in the surface, and then looking at differences in the soil, which you can find out through ground-based geophysics techniques. So you have a whole number of different ways in which you can start to search for these buried features. And what we did was we wanted to get a better understanding of the relationship between these processes that aid in detection and how they change over time. So we know that if you're looking at crops, for example, you only see it at a certain stage in the crop growth. You can't do crop detection 12 months of the year because the crop is not in the right stage to do that. Similarly, for geophysical prospection, the soils need to be in a state which improves the detection rate. And no one's really done any work on this before. And so work has been done on this, but not in a kind of large-scale way. So what we decided to do was to set up 2 monitoring stations, one in the wet side of the UK, one in the dry side of the UK, so Cambridgeshire and Cirencester. And then we'd excavate out known features, and we'd put soil moisture probes in and temperature probes in them. We'd put weather stations there. We'd start to collect data every 15 minutes or so, and then we'd go there every month, and we'd do geophysical surveys, and we'd do spectro-radiometry readings, and we'd measure the nature of a crop, and we'd measure the nature of all of these other variables that are around there, and do some remote sensing. So we had hyperspectral measurements, and then airborne laser scanning measurements. So we're collecting a whole heap of data associated with these changing feature dynamics. So we could essentially start to collect a gold standard data set, which we could then start to mine to look at these event changes in processes that could lead us to hopefully an insights through which we can start to deploy our sensors more effectively and start to maximize the return on investment on the hardware that we use. Got to bear in mind that these big scanners in the sky cost many thousands of pounds to send up into the air. The budgets for archaeological research and detection are relatively small, so if we are going to do this, we need to time our flights down to science-led rather than just some random flying because we think it's appropriate, particularly given the areas we can cover. So, as I said, we had geotechnical monitoring, we excavated out our ditches, We installed these probes. We took a whole heap of soil samples which have been processed in the lab. We not just dealt with, or we didn't just deal with the archaeological features. We were looking at the contrast between the features themselves and the immediate surroundings. So it's that localized contrast, which is what we're interested in. And yeah, here's the example of the ditch feature itself, what's going on outside of it, what's going on inside of it. And we collected a whole heap of temperature and soil conductivity and permittivity measurements, which we could use to infer moisture content. We undertook geophysical readings. So we had both magnetometry and electric resistance tomography. I keep getting that acronym wrong. These were on a monthly basis. And from here, we found that, particularly with the ERT, in one area, we were only actually detecting features about 3 months of the year. In another area, we were detecting different features about 6 months of the year. But they had an inverse. One was collecting or detecting that data when it was drier, and the other were detecting the features when it was wetter. And so we need to look into how those things are actually working on a dynamic basis, because that has a significant impact on the local curatorial advice. There is no point undertaking these surveys in this area if you're doing it at the wrong time frame. So we're now in the process of feeding that data back, but we also need to get the collateral evidence to show that this isn't just something that happened in this instance, and this is a general change. So again, we have that body of evidence. Crop monitoring, this is the area which I have a major focus on. So here, hopefully you can see that you're seeing a crop mark that's moving around here. We go out every month. This is David, my PhD student, who has a spectro-radiometer on his back that measures across the electromagnetic spectrum. And here you're looking at variations in on-site and off-site archaeological features at different times in the plant growth season. These are all within about 3 weeks of each other. So we're seeing quite major changes within a short space of time on the reflectance characteristics. And here's how we're looking at the different aerial, LiDAR and hyperspectral data that's coming from. Here's resources. So essentially, we've got a big data collection process. What we want to do with that is to feed it through into this evidence-based decision-making framework. So we've got our data, we want to maximize its impact, we start to open it up. We can have these open knowledge frameworks that allow accessible, transparent, and accountable processes, which can then lead through into this DPSIR, drivers, pressures, states, impact response framework, which allows the curatorial and research managers to start to monitor and manage that framework based upon the evidence within their own records and from the sensors that we and others are using. So we went down the open science route to look at how we could improve both novelty and impact, and also to improve engagement. So we get an improved understanding of the process. As I said earlier, better deployment of equipment leading to better knowledge and better decisions. Enhancing the capability. We've put data out there that people haven't used before. We can support this and generally improve the skills across the domain, and to also improve stakeholder engagement. We had on the project 25 heritage, industry, and academic partners. The best way to keep everyone informed is to adopt an open policy. So wherever practical, we said, and this came back to bite me, all data will be in the public domain as soon as possible in accessible repositories. There's a bit of wiggle room in there, but not a lot. And so this would allow the process to be dynamically shared with colleagues throughout the world. So this should improve the scientific process, it should improve our results, it should improve our impact, and it should provide us with more wow moments, which is broadly why we're there. And that's how we sold it. Supporting us in this, we had Cameron Naylan, who is now a policy advocate for PLOS One. He's been a fantastic help in getting us to where we've been. So we're opening up our data, and we're producing a variety of open and accessible resources. And when you start to break that down, that means we're not just opening our data, we're looking at opening our methods leading to open processes. If people are going to reuse this, we need to tell them how they can reuse it. It's the open licenses, what you can do with this data. It's not necessarily always going to be completely public domain, and we'll get onto that a little bit more later on. But it's all under this umbrella term of open science, that provides this kind of science with society. We are working not just within colleagues within the office next door, but colleagues in a different faculty, and colleagues in community groups, and colleagues in curatorial offices, and colleagues in a whole heap of different ways. Those barriers between who you work with just really don't exist anymore. Then in 2012, when we were a couple of years into the project, the Royal Society released Science as an Open Enterprise. And I'm going to read this because it's a very powerful statement. Open inquiry is at the heart of the scientific enterprise. Publication of scientific theories and of the experimental and observational data on which they are based permits others to identify errors, to support, reject, or refine theories, and to reuse data for further understanding and knowledge. Science's powerful capacity for self-correction comes from its openness to scrutiny and change. And that's a really powerful statement that underpins, what we do as scientists and scientific researchers, and that really helped a lot. I want to quickly say what open science isn't. It's not open access. Open access is something that is having a major impact within universities at the moment. Open science is more about providing access to the whole chain of the scientific process, and it's about the discussion. It's about collaboration and working together. Open access is more about giving access to your synthesis in a more engaging, not very engaging, but in an easy way. So it's still maintaining that lecture-based approach. And I think that kind of philosophical difference between those two approaches is very important. So, as I said, we see this all about kind of engagement, data, collaborations, impact, science, and serendipity. And serendipity is a potentially interesting element. So from the data end, we can potentially reduce the data mountain. There's a lot of information held within the silos that can be value added. You can start to georeference some of your imagery. You can start to extract information from within it, because aerial photographs to us are data and not just images. And we can start to digitize that content. If it's open and available under open licenses, you can do that. You have access to the inaccessible. Archaeologists don't get to use hyperspectral data very much. We're one of the first projects to get access to this data, and we've made that publicly available. We've made it available with our supporting processing techniques. That means that this can now be part of an education pack, which can be used to upskill other researchers or any other interested parties. Equally, because we're providing our code, you have Linus's law. Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. We can apply this to data. We're not just saying, this is our stuff, these are our results, believe us. Kind of, this is our stuff, these are our results. If you want to do it, here's the stuff. Go out there and replicate this yourself. And if we're wrong, tell us. And publish your own stuff. Build on our work. We can start to peer review those workflows. And it's over time, we need to see how this builds into trust, provenance, and credibility. Because if we do start to, knock down the silos, we're going to have to start to look at how we build those trust frameworks and how we build that data into formal decision-making processes. And then we move into the open process. And it's improved collaboration. Now, we had a multidisciplinary group within the project, primarily because we knew we were tackling different areas. We had geoengineers, we had computer specialists, we had archaeologists and geotechnical people. And so we were building those connections between the aerial archaeologists and the ground perspection people. They've long known of each other, but not really formally worked with each other because is a big question I'm not going to get into, but we're looking at the same underlying phenomena, and this is a great opportunity for us to work with each other. But it was also more about working across disciplines. Because we were sharing our data immediately with our partners, which included the Royal Agricultural University, we could start to see different routes of exploitation, which we didn't plan for when we wrote the grant. So soil maps, precision agriculture, geosensor devices were all things that were interesting to the RAU. We were also looking at areas in which we needed to look at rapid focusing of attention, which again I'll talk about a little bit more. So these open processes allowed us to kind of essentially look at how we were processing our data, providing a workflow through our data, and allowing that to essentially change throughout the research process. It's about improving impact as well. We were producing better models, we were getting a better understanding of a process, and we were producing, I would say, better quality, richer data. It's there, you can look at it, you can validate it. Should lead through into better decision making. We were providing more reliable models, so using raw rather than generalized data. So not just saying, I told you so, and here's my results that are synthetic and decoupled from the data. This is how I actually transformed it from the raw data. You can either plug that in or you can plug the raw stuff in. So it's providing easier reuse and engagement. And it's serendipity, this free flow of data and ideas, which means that people can get access to your stuff in an easy way and just test things quickly. You don't have to write a grant proposal, you don't have to ask for permission. You just go out there, you get it, you use it, you test it, you write some code around it, you get some results. If it's interesting, build on it. Share it with others, build on it. We don't tell you to share it under specific licenses, we just want you to play with it. And so all of these things mean that we can start to use it in a whole range of different areas, not just within the research sphere, but also to impact on curation and policy, which are the primary upward elements from my point of view, but also feeding into industry, outreach, and education. And we've been working with community groups in particular to find ways in which we can build on both the training and development process. Open citizen science, looking at societal engagement in the archaeological process. And it's an element down here. We are no longer masters of all we survey. The rich data demands that we collaborate effectively with external specialists. Now, we worked with the West Lothian Archaeological Trust. They have, well, not necessarily rocket scientists, but they have rocket physicists in their group. Their knowledge of the physics and their understanding of the sensors that we're using far outstrips anyone with the DART program. They go out and fly kites and do interesting things on weekends. But actually being able to tap into that knowledge base was facilitated by just going out and saying, we've got this stuff, do you want to work with us? When in fact they contacted us in the first instance and we responded positively. And so it's about this kind of element of, or in the long term I see this as the element of refocusing attention, where you can get people looking at your problem and you can get people validating your problem, saying, actually, or this person saying, I need to send this to a physicist who can look at the signal to noise issues associated with this data, because I don't actually know it. But because you've exposed your data and your processing in a way which they can get access to, the aim is that they don't have to waste is probably the wrong term, but spend a lot of time immersing and engaging themselves in your process. They can just look at it and go, actually, I've seen that problem before, it's analogous to A, B, or C, try X, Y, or Z. And because it's open, you can just immerse yourself in the things more effectively, potentially to come out with the best solution or solutions, given the frameworks of in-situ work. So, why do this? Because big people say so. The EU says so. Here we've got, enabling them is not just good for science, it's also necessary for smarter decision making. As the technical complexity of policy, from global warming to macroeconomic management rises, open science supports open government. Transparency in your decision making. UK government says so. Shakespeare Review. If you haven't read it, read it. It's brilliant. This data, to optimise its value to society, must be open, shareable, and where practical, it should be free. They fund everything we do. Well, not everything, but most things we do. Royal Society says so. I read the first quote earlier on. I won't go into that one. It's a bit too long. EPSRC says so. EPSRC-funded research data is a public good, produced in the public interest, and should be made freely and openly available with as few restrictions as possible in a timely and responsible manner. That's pretty unequivocal. Great. Everyone is getting on board on this. It is not just about open access. It is now increasingly about open data. The responsibilities of us as researchers, particularly those researchers who are working on publicly funded projects, is becoming increasingly clear. So, what did we do? We built a data repository. We based this on CCAN from the Open Knowledge Foundation. It's got a full metadata system. We used explicit licenses, which was CC BY, and it isn't actually ODBL, it's an ODC, so it's Open Data Commons by Attribution license. It's to encourage reuse and facilitate tracking. In all honesty, I would quite happy just go for CC and open data. We currently don't track anything particularly well, but we need to try and track impact one way, shape or form. We also use OAI-PMH, so that's Open Archives Initiative protocol for metadata harvesting so that our metadata can then be consumed by other organizations. So within the archaeological domain, you have the Archaeological Data Service. The Archaeological Data Service can just suck out our metadata, reformat it into their own framework, and then advertise our stuff on their website. Same for Europeana. So this means that it's part of a discovery framework. And everyone who sucks up our OEI PMH data is making our data more discoverable. We're not just documenting it, we're making it easier to find. Our data has a URI. It can be called by web processors. It says more later. That's a fight I've been having this morning with your network. There might be not very much of that later on. CCAN has an API, so you can actually start to process the stuff directly within CCAN. Here is CCAN. Here is our repository. All right, fine. No, I don't want to go. Hey. Fantastic. Fingers crossed. It does work. Right. And so we have a number of data sets in here. I still have a few more to put up. So we have our weather data, our different sensors. So we've broken it down into collections where we have our different sensors in each element. Let's have a look at here. For example, this is going to have pretty pictures. So this is the collection for oblique aerial photographs for Hahn Hill. And you see there's a whole heap of photos in there. Here we have our metadata for the collection. So who was the author, who's the maintainer, the instrument that was used, descriptive elements about it, your bibliographic citation. You can cite this collection. That's a big text snippet, so you can put it into your citation manager. Its completeness, start date, end date, a whole heap of stuff. We have a very rich metadata element behind this. In fact, we have an automated ingest process, so we can collect this dynamically no matter what information we have. Its license conditions, where it's been taken from, it's all in there. What processing has happened to it. Similarly, fingers crossed this will work as well. Okay, you can go into the individual resource object. So here is an aerial photograph, and that's the area from which it was taken. And here is now all of the metadata that's specific to this object. So we have both content metadata and discovery metadata. Metadata isn't very exciting. People don't tend to like it, but it's why we went for the automated approach. It took a long time to build up, but now every time we collect something, it can automatically go in there. This kind of infrastructure requires core investment. It's not just for archives. I'm not interested in archiving for archiving's sake. I'm interested in reusing. I'm interested in other people reusing. And so this provides this dynamic and accessible repository environment. So we have our one in Dart. There's things like Figshare, which you may be aware of. There's CCAN and the Data Hub. There's also Europeana, ADS, a whole heap of others. Data repositories are becoming more mainstream. Most, at least universities, are producing their own institutional repository, if only to ensure that they can continue to get grants from EPSRC. If you do not manage your data effectively, you do not get a grant. And so policy has changed and is impacting practice at a university level. On licenses, we use CC BY and ODC BY, both expect attribution. There are other clauses, share alike, non-commercial, no derivatives. Each of those clauses makes that resource less free. You're putting a constraint on what people can do with it. Some of those things can have unintended consequences for reuse and data integration. If you start to put those constraints in, you also need to have someone who's going to manage those constraints, because someone might phone you up to say, you have this data and it says non-commercial and I want to use it for this process, which is a commercial application. Will you sign off the license? Do you have that person in place? Do you have the cost overhead to deal with management of the data that you're putting a license under? The data fragmentation and lack of interoperability between different licenses is important. For example, Creative Commons share-alike license and a Creative Commons non-commercial share-alike license are incompatible. You can't mix data that have those different licenses together because each expects to be shared under the same license terms. So that means that you start to create islands of data. That's a real problem. Get advice from the Open Knowledge Foundation. Don't use your gut reaction if you're getting into the area of licensing. As well as releasing all of our raw data objects, and we wanted to release all of our raw data objects, well, in fact, our raw and processed data objects, because it allows people to look at our raw data, rebuild the processing in the way that they want to do. We also built the integrated database spatiotemporal backend, UML model. So that's a UML model for how we joined all of our data together. We imported everything to Postgres. It's a 2 GB database, and it's now an online environment for data mining and collaborative analysis, which is really what I want to show you, but I can't. We do quite a lot of our stuff in IPython, so it's a Python notebook, so we can share all of the ways that we actually take our raw data in, process it, do numerical transformations to it, and then export that data. So the processing itself, which you won't be able to see here, in fact, it's a very nice little sad face, because that's how I feel about it. We can actually walk you through the assumptions we've made in that processing. It's not a black box anymore. We've opened up the process itself. You can see what we've done with it numerically. You can see how we've changed it. And if you want to change it yourself, you can just build on top of it. So we're not doing black box processing. We are making completely explicit how we're moving from raw data through to information, through to knowledge, through to decision. And that's important, particularly from the mathematical end, when your different environments and the different assumptions in your maths environments have a major impact in how your algorithm is exposed. So, and processed, sorry. What did we learn? Our stakeholders really liked it. Got lots of goodwill generated. We had lots of kind of feel-good events where people were just generally happy to take our stuff and do stuff with it, and generally happy to share stuff back with us. And we've also changed the way that people think about, how they're going to license their data. And most people, if they are collecting things for either the good of themselves or the good of their community or whatever, are quite happy to openly license their data. They just haven't really thought about it. Enhanced collaborations and network, particularly with mates. We've added value to our research by getting extra analysis undertaken for free, because we've given someone who is interested in a water percolation problem access to what they consider to be good, rich data. And so from a little bit of investment from their end, they can get a lot of research impact. That's brilliant. The RAU has used our data to look at carbon sequestration in hedgelands. Not something that we're interested in, but our data feeds directly into that. Data management is placed at the forefront. You don't just kind of tail it in at the, or add it in at the tail end of your project, which means that it never gets done properly. It's an afterthought. And I think that's going to change now, particularly the EPSRC is asking for data management to be higher up the agenda. It allows us the use of web analysis frameworks, which means that we can have workflows and we can start to do, add a broader concert of data processing techniques. That's good, because it's broadly how things are going. Repositories are expensive. As a project, we paid for that. I feel aggrieved that we had to spend money on building up a data repository. Hopefully no one has to do it again as the institutional repositories are built up and people become more aware or are forced to do this. Licensing and IP are complex. Open science is also not seen as a universal good by academics. There are few incentives. Career trajectories are dominated by publication output. You don't get any brownie points for putting your data online. You should get brownie points for putting your data online. You should get brownie points for putting your code online. You should get brownie points for collaborating effectively. You should get brownie points for engaging with the public. But you get brownie points for writing synthesis. It's not right. We need to start to change that. We need to start to link good practice with career progression more effectively. There's a perception of loss of competitive advantage. This is my data. I've worked hard to get this data, and I'm not going to give this to anyone else till I've squeezed the last bits of research life out of this data. And it's kind of, well, that's not really the most effective way to progress science. In our instance, perceptions that it prejudices PhD novelty and publication viability. Data's in the public domain. It means this journal won't publish any paper associated with that data, which is publicly available. I think that's slightly silly, but their argument was it's the leading journal in their field and they have to satisfy it. The publishing PhD novelty I have slight sympathy with, but at the end of the day, You know, I think we need a number of test cases there to see how that works. When this was raised as an issue within the higher framework, within Dart, it was seen as a non-problem. So ultimately, these views are complex, and they do vary throughout the hierarchy and in different domains. What I decide is right for me doesn't mean to say that it's right for the engineering faculty or the humanities faculty. And so this is a complex landscape, and it does change in the different areas. Ethics. Who gets access to this data? You know, what about accreditation systems? What about knowledge-based community stewardship? You know, it's heritage data. You know, if you let some of this online, the great fear is that those evil metal detectorists will go out there and they'll undertake metal detecting surveys over this area and dig up all of this stuff and take it away, and there'll be night hawking and everyone will, you know, gnash their teeth and wail. You win some, you lose some. We need to actually have probably a bit more of an open debate about this, because I'm much more interested in local communities actually engaging with the stewardship of the environment that they manage on a day-to-day basis, maybe curated by English Heritage or Historic Scotland, but the local people who inhabit those landscapes look after that over the longer term. And if we disbar them from access to the data about their local environment, I think that's sending completely the wrong message. But we need to have much more nuanced debate, because at the moment we're far too polarised. But those ethical issues transcend things. It's similar for environmental problems, it's similar in a whole range of different areas. So, what's the future? We need to invest in the infrastructure, data and workflow repositories, interoperable catalogues, and this is not just a problem for academia. We're seeing this with the opendata.gov. As I say, this is not just about archives, it's about dynamic and accessible repositories. You know, it's no point having data which is available in perpetuity if no one actually uses it. For Dart, data mining and visualization is our next key. We have all of this data available. We need to mine it more effectively. Enhanced knowledge-led practice and policy. We want to start feeding through these kind of data frameworks directly through to practice and policy frameworks, so curatorial managers can use these kind of outputs to say, these are the techniques. Based upon our best evidence, these are the techniques we should be using at time A, time B, time C, time D, given the underlying conditions, or how we feed these through to broader pan-European or global detection strategies. We have a project called Thematic, which we put into the final FP7, which didn't go through. So if anybody, either locally or remotely, is interested in risk monitoring applications for heritage, please contact me. And creating a culture of open data and collaborative analysis. So we're trying to do a follow-on fund where we can encourage more of the stakeholders to exploit Dart and other resources. Look at some of the data deposition bottlenecks that's currently in the practical flow, particularly within the geophysics framework. Looking at providing analysis cookbooks so that we can use some of these online processing techniques to allow communities to actually build more effective analytical frameworks. Encouraging multi-stakeholder interactions, what we're currently with Hack Days, we can get some policy people in the room, we can get some good data monging people in the room, we can get some people who have interesting ideas but don't know how to deliver it, and just essentially have this melange of people and just produce stuff that has impact. And that's all wrapped up in an AHRC follow-on fund. So this is my final slide. And this comes from English Heritage. Knowledge is a prerequisite to caring for England's historic environment. From knowledge flows understanding, and from understanding flows an appreciation of value. Sound and timely decision-making and informed and intelligent action. Knowledge enriches enjoyment and underpins the process of change. Great, that's another fantastic statement. Open approaches are more likely to make that kind of stuff happen than just goodwill. Thank you. So we've
got time for a few questions if you're willing to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You have my undivided attention apart from rebooting.
Can I ask one to start off? Honestly, I can. I'm really interested in your methods store, because you talked about your various different stakeholders, in which you included community groups.
Yep.
And I can kind of see the open data, popping it in a repository, makes it sound easy, doesn't it? Making it possible to get it out again. But in terms of the methods, have you succeeded in getting your methods open? Have you succeeded in getting anybody to engage with those methods, and have they produced any data in their turn, if you see what I mean?
Not as yet. We started off, as you know, with a method store with the Open Knowledge Foundation, and that was done broadly on this kind of basis of putting in descriptors and metadata elements to describe what we've been doing with our code to make it somewhat more accessible. And that kind of, in the nature of things, didn't really gain any traction. You know, we are dealing in a kind of fast environment where things do change. What we're working on now, and hopefully, if this does come up, I can actually show you what I mean with the Python networks, is actually probably being a bit more 21st century and putting this through into places like GitHub, which is a code sharing facility, but also using collaborative notebook environments online, which means that people can actually not just take your code and your code sequence, which is documented, but embed it within their document. So things like Sweave, where you can generate your graphs directly within the data of a back end. So where you put your graph, it just says go to this database, do this, do that, do the other. So that's really something we're looking at the follow-on fund. It hasn't been seamless. We've learnt a lot along the way, shall we say. Sorry.
No, just following on from that. So, I mean, being open to different disciplines,
yeah,
then you run the risk of, and I love the connection between data and methods, which I think is important, and often data is just thrown up there and the connection to methods is just missed. But opening it up to different disciplines, those methods, the language used becomes a barrier. How do you try and bridge that for different disciplines?
We haven't had so much, sorry, I'm trying to see if I can get this thing to connect through there. We haven't had too much of a problem there, primarily because we haven't got to the stage of exposing. Well, everything's exposed, but you know those elements haven't been aren't mature yet. It's probably the nice way of putting it. The semantics of what you're doing is always going to be a problem. Everyone uses their own jargon. You know, you don't do science without having your own technical language. So far, that hasn't proven to be that much of a problem. It will be a problem, we know. Linked open data kind of end of this might actually help, where you're linking through to the ontologies that underpin, you know, the descriptors behind what you're using. That could have just meant something to people or just been a jargon-filled sentence. But I see that how workflow systems are starting to develop. As long as you can go up the learning curve of understanding how the workflow systems develop, you can feed through into getting an understanding of what's going on with the data. It comes around documentation at the end of the day and just making things explicit and being a bit anal. And then answering questions when people raise them as well. Sorry, Claire, you.
We measure academic impact by the number of citations on papers at the moment. Is there a way that you can measure impact of your data being used in some similar way in the system that operates at the moment?
I'm not a good person to answer that, and probably in a better position to answer that than I am.
If you have a link to, you know, you clearly had those links to where you could get the data from,
yep.
And here's the, you know, the BibTeX link or whatever for it. But then that isn't then captured at the moment in our current ways of citing. So then the impact of sharing those data, I guess, is lost.
The point of doing it in that way, and putting those BibTeX snippets in there, is to actually make it easier for people to cite the data directly within their publications. We currently don't do it because it's not a tradition of doing it. However, if people using our data, there is a by attribution. It is quite clear, but you know, no one's enforcing it, and no one will enforce the fact that someone's taken our data and not, you know, not attributed it in their publication. As I say, I don't really mind too much, because there are a whole heap of problems with kind of license stacking as well, as soon as you get all of these things just going one on top of the other. But there is also, as you say, a need for both the government and the individual researchers associated with that content to track its impact for, you know, how it's being spent. You know, what is the benefit to UK PLC? What is the benefit to the research institution? What is the benefit?
The benefit of putting all those data online. It's clearly a hell of a lot of work.
Yep.
Putting it availably accessible to lots of people, but if
it hasn't
uses it,
done a huge amount of good for my career, because the cost of doing that for me is not writing the papers.
Yeah.
Okay, and that is a real cost, and I'm not going to tell you that it isn't, but it's also the way things are going, and as these institutional repositories are coming online, and as you will be expected to deposit your data within these institutions, if we don't incentivize the whole process of putting data in there and putting good quality both documentation of the data and discovery metadata, people just put in rubbish. If there's no value in putting in good quality metadata, and metadata is tedious. It is one of the most dull things that you can do with your life. But if you want your stuff to be reused, it's really important. And we need to start to automate that. There are lab information systems that deal with this really effectively. But not all of us are in the position to use those lab frameworks and are dealing with kind of dirty workflow processes. And we need to start to get those, formalize those systems so that we are producing good quality metadata. Because if we've got good data without good metadata, we're wasting our time. Sorry.
Sorry. Yes, my question is very related to the first and the last. For instance, the first one I'm very interested about the communities. When you said communities engaged in scientific thinking, not only sharing data, but with the methods, with the analyzing the evidence. Which kind of community are you talking? The academic, the students, or any citizen?
Well, there's a whole heap of different communities. We've got an educational component of what we're doing. We've been out to a couple of workshops, but primarily one out in Poznan in Poland, where we were taking out hyperspectral data. We took the spectro-radiometry equipment out there, told them to get a couple of plants to torture one for a couple of days and not give it any water, so that they both looked the same, but they could then put it outside under the sun, put the spectroradiometer over it and show, oh, that one looks stressed, and that one looks healthy. Visibly, you can see no difference, but we can tell it. We can tell the difference, but it's providing that data to the next generation of people and starting to build up that capability of those scientists, working with organisations like West Lothian Archaeological Trust, who are a solely community-led group of people, where they came out and helped us with the thermal experiment. We did a thermal experiment, 24 hours, over 4 days. No, sorry, no, it's 24, 48. It's 96 hours of experiment where we were going up and down scaffolding towers, taking thermal measurements to look at variations in thermal ramping over 4 diurnal periods to find out how we could use thermal measurements to detect subsurface stuff. They were out there helping us with that. So we were building in networks in a variety of different levels. We work closely with the curatorial agencies in Historic Scotland, Royal Commission of Historic Monuments in Wales and English Heritage, because the outputs of this kind of stuff feed through to the whole decision-making processes throughout the UK.
Yes, I think that is very relevant, very interesting presentation, because scaffolding those skills, I think that's very important, because for instance, data, if you are working with a collaborative repository for data collection, then you need to not only think about citation, but the quality of this data, reliability. So if you are scaffolding all this process, then you are also talking about data quality, the process of collection, and so, yes.
In general, this isn't just DART was never just a research project. The outcomes of DART were geared to have impact at a policy and practice level wherever possible. We weren't just doing it because it's an interesting problem. It is an interesting problem, I really like it. But we needed to ensure that we were trying to also strive to achieve policy, practice, impact, I think primarily, but also if we could then leverage in community impacts. You know, it's not just about the research. Research is a vehicle that pulls a whole heap of other stuff along with it.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant presentation. It's a wonderful project. You mentioned about the kind of reward and recognition issue, which I think is huge. You know, how do we move to a situation where we can judge excellence in research? Excellence in open research is maybe where we want to be rather than excellent research. So park that for a minute and then say, okay, for you personally, where was the kind of moment, was there a kind of light bulb moment where you suddenly thought, actually this open science business looks like it's got amazing potential, I mean, it looks like it could work, or it looks like it's worth exploring. I mean, what was the moment that made you think?
I was very fortunate to go away on a Nesta-funded Crucible program. You know, Crucible is an obvious metaphor, it's a melting pot, for which they brought 20 up-and-coming researchers, young researchers, which I was quite flattered by, to go away for a number of 3-day events, and at which they would be exposed to a whole heap of different things about the research process and the position of research in society. And at one of these, you know, it included having presentations from the Science Committee, Government Science Committee, and journalists, and a whole heap of very interesting and rewarding experiences. Part of this, there was a presentation from Cameron Naylor, who has been advocating open science for a number of years, and it just clicked. And it made me start to reappraise what I thought the science process was, because I hadn't really done it up until that point. You just go along the process and people tell you that things happen in this way and you just accept it. You carry on doing it in that way because, well, why do you question what people have done for centuries? You know, we're still using a 400-year-old publication model to distribute our scientific progress. And that's ludicrous. But until you sit back and think about it, it's not ludicrous, because it's just what you do, because we need to publish, because that is the currency of academic careers. And yeah, I thought it was ludicrous. So I wrote a grant that did it differently. And it was hard, because you're fighting against people, well, you're not fighting against people, but you know, you're trying to jolly people along in the same way who, you know, haven't been through that journey that you've been through. And it's going, why are you doing it this way? It's because I think it's right. Or now I can say, because RCUK say that we should be thinking in this way. And EPSRC say that we should be thinking this way. And that helps. That really does help. So, you know, I think there's that element of evangelism, which is nice. But I think the policy shift in telling you that that's what you're going to do is the big game changer. And I'm really glad that's happened.
So do you think the missing, well, for me, the missing piece of the jigsaw is the personal recognition? Yeah,
that currently, people will do it because they're forced to do it, but they won't do it very well because there's no value in it for them. Unless they get to have some, you know, relatively clever people who can build up automated ingest systems that collect rich discovery metadata, rich documentation metadata, and expose the resources in a way which can be, well, also expose them under licenses that are actually meaningful. If anyone uses a non-commercial license, oh, Jesus. But, you know, expose the data in a way where it can be web processable. You know, putting it behind silly firewalls or this thing of, you know, sign in to get access to this data. Stop it. Stop putting barriers in the way of your data. Just let it get out there, because people will build on it. And once it's built on, you know, you might actually get credit for it. The credit, it's the by attribution thing that's going to probably be the biggest weirdness, and how we actually start to track attribution through workflow and processing environments, or we force attribution to be made in order to, you know, determine impact, because that's the thing that people are going to want to, you know, are going to need to advance their careers. And so that attribution system still doesn't work that well. But I'm no expert on that. You know, Cameron Naylor knows more about that than I do. So those people, yeah. It's been hard, but it's been fun.
I'm just wondering, so I think you're probably quite well placed to comment on this. The open science approach and what you've done moves the argument along quite far in terms of the infrastructure to make data available and open it up to people and do it in a way that will be accessible and can be found, all those aspects. But the second half of the coin, you know, the other side, the social side of changing practice, isn't opening the door to make it accessible or make it available, but actually change the practice of research in terms of using data. So now, you know, within your department, how many folks would reuse open data sets? You know, how would you change that element of practice? How do you get it into the discipline?
It's generation. I think it's probably a generational thing more than anything else.
Nah, come on, that's rubbish. What's the process, though? You can't just say it's the young people to do it right. What's the process? What's going to make the change?
Into what exactly? People just doing open science or using the data that's there?
Reusing the data and open science that's available. How can we get them to really use it and get recognition?
Well, I do think it is a generational thing. Okay. As much as you might not like that, because you know, final year project students will use that stuff. You know, some of the other, I don't know. That's
will
hard.
That get the recognition that we're really talking about here?
Sorry,
will that create the recognition in terms of science and actually change practice over time?
It will do in a you know 20, 30 years time. It's a hard question.
Sure.
You know, you're talking. It gets back to the issue of semantics in some respects as well. If you're looking at something that's going to have an impact on a policy and practice, saying at a national and international level, where you have each of these different data repositories, you've got to find ways to start to aggregate those data together, where you've got different underlying semantics and what's been talked about, different formats in the way that the data is structured. Now all of that is resolvable. A lot of it is partially resolvable through linked open data. But you know, opening data in its own right is not a complete panacea to some of these bigger issues. So there are associated technical developments in, I would say, primarily semantic web. But semantic web, I think, is being heavily oversold at the minute. And there's no killer app for it. There's a lot more RDF data being made available, but nobody building really exciting applications using it. So, you know, for it to come into its own, we need to deal with those integrating distributed repositories to help in unplanned decision-making problems, I would say. So you can just plug things in and do it a flexible way. Equally with the workflow environments. The catalyst to doing that, yeah, as a generational answer is, yeah, probably weak, but I haven't given it that much thought.
What about things, so like the data, sorry, just to follow on, the opendata.gov.uk,
yeah,
you know, approaches you mentioned earlier, and things like Ordnance Survey and stuff making their data available.
Yeah.
You know, those initiatives, unless they start to have the impact, you know, the opendata.gov one, the contribution of data has dropped dramatically. You know, that isn't going to be sustainable.
I think there's a certain element of Wild West there as well. The things are kind of reformulating. The metadata on the opendata.gov site is appalling. You can't really find anything. Yeah. Some of it moves and changes, so you don't have stable URIs, so you can't build applications around data which are moving. I think that will change. Sure. It's got to change, you know, because you know, if you're expecting third parties to build robust, you know, processes on this, you can't expect that to change all the time. And the OS are leaders in this. The OS are doing great work in exposing their data and exposing it in a persistent way. But we're still not seeing, you know, game-changing derivatives. Fingers crossed. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, going back to the discussion you were having there, whether you turn the problem around the other way. You started from the old kind of evidence-based policy, yeah?
Yep.
And that's, you build up this data set, which is partly funded by 2 research councils. So I turn it around the other way and say, okay, the research councils define a project which would require researchers to interrogate the data. You turn around the other way and say, okay, what's the policy issue we need an answer to?
Well, but it also gets back to this kind of point of, which Claire and I discussed last night, is about, you know, if your data is out there, people stealing your research or reusing the data that you put in the public domain. Well, that's good. You can start to show scientific robustness. If you have two researchers who have taken the same data set, done processing on it independently, come to similar results, that's a scientific bonus. We're showing rigour in our results, we're showing reliability in our process. And so exposing those workflows and exposing the data in that way, so you can demonstrate ultimately that you have the thing that you've shown is rigorous in multiple dimensional, multiple approaches, is powerful from a scientific point of view. So, yes, I think you're right.
As long as it's accredited, I suppose. It's all about accrediting the person who, or the team who've put the data up in the first place.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be the only way around all these issues.
But this is a similar problem with kind of citizen science applications. And over time, we could get to the stage of just, we can start to be a bit more nuanced about the nature of our scientific researchers. Not every research scientist is good at data collection. Some of them are fantastic, but they're all put in the same box at the minute. And it's kind of, well, actually, let's get those people who collect gold standard raw data, collecting gold standard raw data. Let's get those people who are fantastic data interpreters doing fantastic data interpretation, because their data capture is just appalling. And let's maximise the skills of our diverse research community. We cannot do everything on our own, and we need to start to fragment that system so we can play to our skills. We have great data collectors. Let them do data collection and collaborate with those people who can do the analysis effectively. Wrapping all of those skills up within 1, 2 people or a small team now, I think is becoming increasingly problematic. So
at the moment it's completely open access. You don't have to click any terms and conditions with regards to citing the data. Would that not be a way around it, or would that be something we're completely opposed to?
Sorry?
Would that not be a way around it, to actually sign up? We actually say that you agree to the terms and conditions that if you use this data in a publication that you will reference.
Yeah, it would, but then it puts a layer of stuff where people will be turned away from using it.
But okay, but most of us click terms and conditions, and how many of us actually read it?
Yeah,
I mean,
but
it stops you.
It could do. We kind of debated that. The element is that I don't want that in the workflow chain. So if anything that stops the data just being processed because someone's on a whim processing the data, I just don't want that to happen.
It could be your Achilles heel as well.
It could be, yeah. I was made redundant, so it's fine. I can now do what I want. I think it's for other people to decide how these things are going to be tracked. The fact that RCUK and EPSRC are saying, you will start to put your data, or the EPSRC statement is, publicly accessible data under whatever practical time frame. That's great, but people will start to ask those questions about attribution, and someone will come to a decision about it. I broadly don't care. I just want people to use it. We've got, I think, a pretty gold standard data set that has research value for a number of years. I don't think there's going to be another project that's going to collect stuff like we've collected. It behoves us to make that available so the impact that it has can be maximised, because it should, I hope, change the way we think about not just archaeological prospection, but all of the curatorial and management issues surrounding that. So that's, for me, the major reason for doing it. And that's part of my social contract for undertaking research.
Okay, well, thanks ever so much. I'm buzzing with questions, but then I would be. But just thank you ever so much. I think it was a really, really interesting talk. Thanks for coming with you.
My pleasure.